Welcome to week 3 of Cultures in Conflict. This week we will be exploring cultural starting points and delve into each of them in detail. In Chapter 3 of our course, the text starts off with a review or a reminder from Chapter 2 that culture has been defined as the shared, often unspoken understandings for cultural fluency, or the ability to communicate effectively across cultures. The text goes on to simplify this definition by saying that culture is the way that we get things done around here. Our text also reminds us that culture is inextricable, or something from which there is no escape, from conflict. After that brief review, we go on to learn how different cultures can be accepted through the experiences of others. The way that the inhabitants of a rural island located south of Mindanao, Philippines, view death as a celebration as opposed to how many other cultures see death as a solemn event. It is pointed out that when a non-resident observes the celebrations that occur on this island when a loved one passes, that non-residents will be, in all likelihood, completely surprised at these people's response to death. We are told that this is a normal response, and surprise happens whenever someone's normal expectations are not met. A lesson that can or should be learned from this surprise is that we have to recognize and set aside our cultural assumptions and embrace the realities of the cultural norm that we're experiencing through this surprise. We are also reminded that cultural perspectives are never only one way, normally our way as we perceive it, but they are multidimensional interactions that shape our cultural identities as they affirm, challenge, and even jostle them. We go on to learn that stereotypes will often occur as we begin to recognize alternatives to our cultural norms. We are told we should learn to recognize these stereotypes when they occur and use them as a cue for us to make necessary adjustments to our views of a cultural norm that is different from our own. Next, we move into the meat of Chapter 3, when we learn about the 6 cultural starting points to help reduce the confusion and complexity that different cultures bring to our relationships. Those cultural starting points include high context and low context, individualism and communitarianism, universalism and particularism, specificity or diffuseness, sequential time and synchronous time, and low power distance and high power distance. In an increasingly connected and interdependent world, effective communication not only becomes more important, but also much more difficult. Ironically, it is often not dissimilar languages that cause the greatest problems, but rather much more mundane and harder to detect cultural differences. One such difference is that of a high context culture versus a low context culture. A high context culture is one in which the communicators assume a great deal of commonality of knowledge and views, so that less is spelled out explicitly and much more is implicit or communicated in indirect ways. High context cultures are vulnerable to communication breakdowns when they assume more shared understanding than there really is. They are strongly inclined to indirect methods of communication. This is especially true in an age of diversity. Examples of high context cultures might include the Japanese, the Arabs, and the French. A low context culture is one in which things are fully, though concisely, spelled out. Things are made explicit, and there is considerable dependence on what is said or written. In a low context culture, more responsibility is placed on the listener to keep up their knowledge base and remain plugged in to informal networks. Low context cultures, on the other hand, are not known for their ability to tolerate or understand diversity, and they tend to be more insular. The explicitness with which they communicate can often cause offense and resentment. Low context cultures might include Anglos, or people of British Isles descent in the Americas, New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia, the Germans, and Scandinavians. Interactions between high and low context people can be problematic. For example, the Japanese can find Westerners to be offensively blunt, but Westerners can find the Japanese to be secretive, devious, and bafflingly unforthcoming with information. The French can feel that Germans insult their intelligence by explaining the obvious, while Germans can feel that French provide no direction. The point, of course, is that in an age of diversity, these cultural differences are just as likely to appear across a desk as they are across borders. From this, we have learned a common geographic location does not always guarantee a common heritage. In addition, the value of understanding the differences between high and low context cultures is by understanding the different ways people communicate. Whenever there is a miscommunication, understanding the miscommunication may simply be a result of one side or the other, or both, not understanding how the other person communicates. Also, this understanding of different communication styles allows us, as the receiver of communication, the ability to understand or recognize the cue of high context and low context communication when we experience it. This, in theory, will help eliminate culture conflicts, which naturally can reduce or stop effective communication. Breaking this down in its most simplistic form would be to say that the starting point that I want to make you aware of here is that we understand how people view themselves based on their individual cultural experiences that they've had in their lives. In some cultures, such as the United States, identity and self-awareness comes from the concept of individualism, which is revered and respected. In other cultures, such as South Africa, identity and self-awareness comes from the community, which is communitarianism, as a whole. We learn through this knowledge. Our starting point cue is to understand where the person we are communicating with gets his or her identity and self-awareness from, as an individual or as part of a community. Universalism refers to a broad application of the rules, laws, and generalizations to all people. Universalism places an emphasis on the standardization and mass production of these rules and judgments about one's behavior, and how they live their life are based on these concepts. Particularism refers to the exact opposite, the exceptions to the rules and the generalizations that are applied to people. Particularism places an emphasis on a person's uniqueness, innovation, and creativity, and thus on creating a custom-fit behavior for each person. Again, a person or group's approach to a perceived conflict may be based upon one of these two concepts. Thus, for a communicator to understand the starting point of why another group or person has adopted their approach to a conflict, either through universalism or particularism, it can be an invaluable tool to use towards conflict resolution. Quite simply, specificity and diffuseness refers to the degree of a specific versus a more patterned focus. Otherwise, the specific focus values efficiency, performance, tasks, goal achievement, and finally the outcome, while a diffuse focus values attention to the process, the relationships, and the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish. The starting point is important because once one side understands the other side's approach and accepts it, they very often can find that they have areas by which they agree, and once those areas are identified, attitudes often change and progress can be made. Also, in especially heated conflicts, the knowledge, specificity, and diffuseness approaches to conflict can be used to a facilitator's advantage. What I mean is, initially, the group discussion could begin in a diffuse way, since there is probably no relational foundations for trust within the group. By starting in the diffuse approach to the meeting, time can be spent in the abstract and with big picture experiences and thinking that will eventually produce specific outcomes. This can then help the group devise specific outcomes, segueing into the specificity meeting approach. Sequential time, or clock time as some refer to it, is just that: hours, minutes, days, months, etc. In societies where sequential time is valued, time is considered to be rigid or exact. Most Western societies use sequential time as a starting point. In societies who use sequential time, it is usually separated into the past, present, and future increments. These societies believe that time should not be lost because time is money, right? And as a result, they favor youth, energy, and vitality. Synchronous time, on the other hand, tends to be cyclical or reoccurring. Episodic, meaning intermittent, and circular. The starting point allows one to see time as chaotic, spiraling, and overlapping. Because this approach to time is soft or elastic, it stretches it into an unlimited and overlapping continuity, which involves simultaneous occurrences of many things that involve many people. Understanding these two cultural starting points can be crucial in conflict resolution, as many cultures see time from a different perspective. In the US, time is everything, and then using time the most effectively is very important. In other cultures, like India, for example, time is more than one person's lifetime. It stretches into the past, the present, and the future of that person, and through that experience, the person sees the continual honoring of those experiences as an unbreaking, non-exact measurement of life itself. What that means is that people of these cultures do not place a premium on being on time or as time is an exact thing, but just as a measurement of their past, present, and future experiences. Power distance is the degree of deference or respect and acceptance of unequal power between people. High power distance would say that some people are simply superior to others because of their social status, their gender, race, age, education, birth, personal achievements, or family lineage. Status in a high power distance relationship is normally assigned, not necessarily earned. Low power distance, on the other hand, would say that people hold status and authority because of what they've accomplished. However, the concepts of democracy and the ability to voice one's feelings and thoughts are also embraced. Again, understanding these two starting points can be crucial in conflict resolution, as many cultures see power in a relationship from a different perspective. In the United States, low power distance is the norm, especially in an employee versus employer type relationship. Bosses are usually assigned based on their accomplishments in the workplace, and even some outside accomplishments such as education. High power distance is the norm in, say, a Japanese household, where the grandparents have a lot of authority in the family structure due to their age and their life experience. To close out the chapter, our authors emphasize that the starting points reviewed in this chapter do not exist in isolation. What they mean by that is that all starting points of any one continuum are not mutually exclusive, and in all likelihood, when dealing with a conflict, there may be more than one starting point that one needs to consider in order to hope to have a constructive effect on the conflict. The starting points discussed in this chapter are not always reliable guides to every person, because we're all different, nor are they fixed in nature. They are intended to create awareness and give the reader tools to recognize cultural differences that may or may not exist and that may cause cultural conflicts, especially if they are not recognized and acknowledged. Our authors close by emphasizing that cultural understanding begins with each of us being willing to commit to a process of increasing our self-awareness, curious observation, ongoing reflection, and dialogue with others. They believe that if a person is armed with the cultural starting points that we've discussed this week, we'll be able to recognize those cultural differences, why they exist, and the ability to navigate through any conflicts that arise. This week, there is a fantastic playlist of YouTube videos related to cultural starting points. Be sure to check them out as they provide a lot of fascinating insight into cultural starting points and how we can leverage them to further conflict management. Have a great week.